Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here and I'm looking forward to talking about this topic. This might be a highly contentious topic just because I know people get very defensive about food, especially Italians. And if we talk about Italian Americans versus motherland Italians, as I like to call them, this is a very tumultuous topic that often causes a lot of debate online. So we're going to get into it, and as always, I'm going to provide you with a historical context for why this happened, how this happened. And I mean, we should answer the question, is Italian American food even really Italian at the end of the day? Now, in terms of historical context, something that we should understand and talk about, I've mentioned it before on this channel, but there was a period of Italian history that was much longer than the current state of Italy, as a matter of fact, where Italy wasn't unified. So pre-unification, these were generally speaking feudal societies and kingdoms, and basically people, the vast majority of people worked as peasants. They were paying really high taxes. They were basically just working to survive. And those are the majority of the people that ended up eventually moving to the United States and the rest of the Americas. Now, the people at that time were quite poor. Remember, these were peasant laborers. And so they didn't have a lot that they had access to. I mean, a lot of the food that they had access to was, maybe like some cornmeal, legumes like chickpeas and beans, lentils. They did have olive oil and they had access to those kinds of goods, but really the options were quite scarce. And so when those people moved to the United States, in some cases, they didn't even have access to the same ingredients in the US as they did in the motherland. Food was quite precious to them, and so it's not a surprise that they would have brought some of those traditions along with them. Now, a lot of these immigrants were coming from the South, and these were generally very poor regions. As I mentioned before, the majority of the people that were going were quite poor, and so when they got to the US, where things were a lot more abundant and they had options that they had really never come in contact with before, that, of course, influenced the food that they cooked in the States, in addition to not having access to some of the ingredients that they were familiar with back home. Meat was something that was quite rare in the motherland. This was a really expensive good and something that they didn't largely have access to except for maybe special events or occasions. So that meant that meat wasn't a huge part of the cuisine at that time. Once they got to the US in particular, they had much more access to things like cheeses, certainly meat, dairy, these sorts of items that otherwise weren't so available and were actually quite scarce. So Italian immigrants adapted their flavors and their dishes to what they had access to in the supermarkets. And this is one of the reasons why Italian American cuisine has so much garlic as opposed to the food in Italy. A lot of Italian Americans don't realize that when you go to Italy, garlic isn't actually that common to use in Italian food. I mean, they use it, okay, but usually they use it as an infuser. They don't even chop it up necessarily and mix it into things like we do in the States. It's usually just like maybe a whole clove or a few cloves of garlic just crushed, and then they eventually remove that from whatever it is that they're cooking, right? In the US, however, that's an ingredient that's really common in Italian American cuisine, as well as some other seasonings like dried oregano. Again, these were things that weren't readily used in Italy, certainly not in the same way or in the abundance that we had in the United States. And so it sort of exaggerated those flavor profiles when they got to the US. And there's some evidence to suggest that because these were already familiar ingredients that they had in Italy, they just weren't using them as much. Once they got to the US, that was something that they recognized in the supermarkets and in the markets in general. And so they started using them just much more often because it was something that they were used to, right? As I already mentioned, meat was certainly more abundant and readily available, so they started to add meat into their dishes, and this is why we end up with like spaghetti and meatballs, for example. You probably won't find spaghetti and meatballs in Italy if you go. That's not something that really exists. Now, you might find meatballs and you might find spaghetti, but the idea of putting them together in an Italian dish in Italy wouldn't probably happen unless you're within a really touristy part of the city, like in Rome or something. They started to use a lot more cheeses, and they also started to increase their portion sizes. So historically speaking, portion sizes in Italy were quite small, again, because the food was scarce to begin with, and they had very large families to feed. So portion sizes were quite small. In the United States, again, due to the abundance that we had, the portion sizes got quite large, and that also became something that was really typical within the Italian restaurant industry. Americans of other origins started to really like Italian food as well, especially after World War II, when soldiers were returning from being deployed abroad. They came back to the U.S. with a new flavor palette, right? And they had sort of acquired a taste for Italian food. So these were patrons that often went to Italian American restaurants, and that meant that Italian American restaurants started to have more customers, and they began to adapt their taste to the palates of the people that were going to the restaurants, right? Once Italian American restaurants started to become more common, and they might even have been seen as something kind of, I don't know, like ethnic food or exotic, let's say. So they started to create more dishes that were common that, again, were catering towards the taste of their patrons. This is where we get the idea of spaghetti and meatballs, chicken parmesan, even garlic bread, right? Like these things don't exist in Italy. And I would say that for the majority of Italian Americans, we're really accustomed to those flavors and those dishes. Now, when I was doing my research about this topic, I found it really interesting and kind of funny that Italians were heavily involved in the Prohibition era, okay? So basically, Prohibition meant that alcohol was prohibited, right? It was basically illegal to get it, and people would be heavily fined and in some cases charged for using or selling alcohol. A lot of Italian restaurants became speakeasies, and so people were using them as underground bars. People were selling homemade alcohol, and in some cases homemade wines. This is really interesting history that I would like to get into in a totally different video. Maybe I can do a part 2 or 3 about this topic, but yeah, it's just really interesting to think about the ways that basically Italian Americans influenced the alcohol industry a lot in the United States. Then later on, as the suburbs in the United States began to grow and become more populous, convenience kind of took over, and people started to buy canned products or even ultra-processed foods. This was still something that was quite new because refrigeration wasn't as popular as it is today, but in any case, they were making takeaway items that you could just, like, they were packaged and you could cook at home. So this is kind of where the idea of delivery pizza and box pizzas and, take home lasagna and that kind of thing became really popular. Also, something that's really interesting is the way that the American government influenced a lot of these decisions, particularly in the public school system. I already did a video about the school system and education in the United States for Italian Americans, but I didn't talk about this topic. It's interesting how this is something that I think a lot of Italian Americans, even in my generation and in the generation before mine, experienced a little bit of, I don't want to call it embarrassment, but certainly the food that we were being sent to school with by our parents was a lot different from the other kids. And I remember actually on a flight that I had not that long ago, there was an old woman. She was an old Italian American woman. We got talking about things, and she told me about how her mom would always send her with things that they ate at home, and that this was so different from the food that her classmates were eating. And what was interesting about her story, and something that I can definitely relate to, is that basically the other kids, the classmates, wanted to eat her food, although she was made to feel like her food was embarrassing or different. And so in some cases, they actually bargained with her for her to trade her food to them. Anyway, just a really interesting, I think, Italian-American experience to have something very different from your classmates or different from your peers. So no, Italian-American food isn't exactly Italian food, right? I mean, it is in its own way its own kind of cuisine. I would say that Italian-American food is sort of its own brand altogether. And sometimes when I'm in Italy and people ask me about this, they're like, do you like Italian-American food? Is it good? And I always say, yeah, I mean, it tastes good. Is it Italian food? Not exactly, right? And I mean, I don't want you guys to get mad and offended by that, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that given the history and the influence of American culture, the influence of the products that they had access to, the ingredients and so on, it really changed the way that Italian immigrants were doing food when they came to the Americas. That is historical fact, okay? Something else to consider is that, you know, in Italy, food began to evolve through industrialization and that sort of thing. They had mills and they had the ability to plant more things and get seeds and various different items from other countries and other regions. And so, of course, this spread out quite far, and this evolved the cuisine in Italy, even though we still have very traditional items from each region, and that's a topic in and of itself, let's say. But the Italian immigrants that moved to the United States and to the rest of the Americas, they didn't follow those traditions. They didn't evolve alongside those traditions because simply they weren't going home. They weren't having access to what was going on in the motherland, right? So that meant that Italian American food kind of became its own thing. Again, in my opinion, this is the food that I was raised on, okay? I'm not saying that it's bad by any means. I'm just saying that it's quite different, and I'm not even sure that we should compare them. In all honesty, I feel like, as I already said, it's almost a category of its own. Regardless of everybody's opinion on this topic, okay, what I do find really fascinating is that this was a group of people that were very poor. They had very little to their name. They, in some cases, were very low-skilled laborers that moved across the world to start a new life, and they developed their own traditions, their own cuisine, their own life. And I just find that that's really fascinating. It's something that I'm really proud about, and I think that a lot of Italian Americans are as well. It's something that should be embraced. I know that motherland Italians don't necessarily like that part of Italian American culture. In some cases, they don't even consider Italian Americans Italian. And, you know, I can understand that. That's their opinion. And if that's how they feel about it, then, you know, they're entitled to whatever they want to believe. All that to say, I do think that it's a source of pride, food in and of itself, no matter where you go. I mean, I've traveled a lot, and I can say that one of the main topics discussed in every country that I go to is the topic of food, traditional items, traditional flavors, and so on. I think that Italian American cuisine is exactly the same way. It's its own thing. It shouldn't even be compared to that of Italian food within the motherland. And let's just leave it there. At the end of the day, the Italian American food tradition is a story of adaptation, pride, and community. And even if it's not authentic Italian, it's still authentic to the people that created it. I'm definitely going to be doing a part 2, potentially even a part 3 about this topic. There was just way too much to consider and put into one video. It was going to be enormous, and I just feel like it's much more fun to break it up into parts. But all that to say, if there's anything else that you would like me to talk about before I shoot those videos, let me know. I love this topic, and I love talking about the history involved with all of these traditions. So if that's something that you're interested, please do let me know. Like, share, comment, subscribe. All of these things really help out the channel, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.